This isn't the story of an invention. It's the story of a man who survived what never stopping does to a human mind. Thomas Edison. Failure, obsession, isolation, and relentless persistence, where breaking is not an option. Before the world called him a genius, before the patents and the headlines, Thomas Edison was just a sickly boy in a cold house, coughing through the Michigan winters, and learning early that the world had no patience for weakness. He was born in 1847, the youngest of 7, in a family that was already running out of hope. His mother, Nancy, watched over him with worry. His father, Samuel, was restless and often absent, chasing failed business schemes and leaving the family to scrape by. Thomas was small, pale, and prone to illness. He suffered from ear infections that left him half-deaf before he was 12. The world sounded muffled, distant, as if he was always underwater. He didn't speak until he was nearly 4. When he did, the words came out in a rush, too many, too fast, tumbling over each other. He asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. Why is the sky blue? Why do people die? Why does the clock tick? He wanted to know everything, and he wanted to know it now. School was a disaster. The teacher, overwhelmed and underpaid, saw only a disruptive child who couldn't sit still, who stared out the window, who scribbled in the margins of his books. Addled, the teacher called him. Difficult, slow. The word stuck. It followed him home, where his father repeated it like a curse. You'll never amount to anything, Tom. You're too slow. He tried to fit in. He tried to be quiet, to be good, to be what they wanted. But his mind was always racing, always somewhere else. He built little machines out of scraps, took apart clocks, and put them back together wrong. Set up chemical experiments in the basement that filled the house with smoke and fear. He was a problem to be managed, not a child to be understood. The other children avoided him. He was the odd one, the one who didn't hear when you called his name, the one who asked questions that made you feel stupid. He learned to keep to himself, to hide his curiosity, to swallow his frustration. He spent hours alone, reading anything he could find, dreaming of a world where questions were not a crime. His mother was the only one who saw him. She sat with him at night, reading by candlelight, answering his questions with patience and love. She told him he was not slow, not broken, not a mistake. She told him he was different, and that different could be powerful if he survived long enough to prove it. But the world outside was not patient. The world outside was cold and hard and quick to judge. Thomas Edison learned early that being different meant being alone. He learned that the world would not wait for him to catch up. He learned that survival meant enduring the labels, the laughter, the loneliness. This was not the beginning of a legend. It was the beginning of a boy who learned, before he could even write his name, that the world would never make room for him. He would have to carve it out himself, one question at a time. There's a moment in every outcast's life when the world stops pretending to care. For Thomas Edison, that moment came in a one-room schoolhouse, surrounded by children who already knew he was different. He lasted only a few months in formal education. The teacher, overwhelmed by Edison's constant questions and restless energy, called him addled in front of the class. The word stung. It was meant to shame him, to put him in his place. Instead, it marked him as a problem to be removed. He was expelled, not with ceremony, but with a quiet, final conversation. "He's holding the other children back," the teacher told his mother. "He doesn't belong here." The message was clear. Thomas Edison was not worth the trouble. He walked home that day in silence, the world suddenly smaller and colder. He was 7 years old, and already the doors were closing. But Nancy Edison refused to let her son be erased. She pulled him from school and taught him at home, turning their cramped house into a sanctuary for questions. She read to him for hours, let him follow his curiosity wherever it led. She encouraged his experiments, even when they filled the kitchen with smoke or ruined the good tablecloth. She told him he was not slow, not broken, not a burden. She told him he was meant for something more. The world outside didn't change. The neighbors still whispered. His father still doubted. But inside, Edison found a kind of freedom. He read everything. He could get his hands on history, science, philosophy, anything that promised a glimpse of how the world worked. He built a chemistry lab in the basement, filled with bottles and wires and the constant threat of disaster. He took things apart and put them back together, sometimes better, sometimes worse. He learned by failing. He learned by breaking things. He learned by refusing to stop. But the isolation was real. He had no friends, no classmates, no one to share his obsessions with. The loneliness pressed in, heavy and constant. He wondered if he would ever belong anywhere, if there was a place in the world for someone who couldn't sit still, who couldn't stop asking why. This was not the story of a prodigy. It was the story of a boy who was pushed out, shut down, and left to find his own way. It was the story of a mother's stubborn love and a child's refusal to disappear. Edison's education was not a gift. It was a fight, and it was only just beginning. Childhood ended early for Thomas Edison. By 12, he was working out of necessity, not ambition. His father's business failures had left the family teetering on the edge of poverty. There was no time for dreams, only for survival. He sold newspapers and candy on the Grand Trunk Railroad, hustling from car to car, learning the rhythms of commerce and the indifference of strangers. The work was exhausting. The pay was meager. He watched men in suits ignore him, watched other boys laugh at his deafness, watched the world move on without him. He was a child in a man's world, and the world didn't care if he kept up. He set up a tiny chemistry lab in the baggage car, using his earnings to buy bottles and powders, always chasing the next experiment. The conductors tolerated him until the day a bottle exploded and set the car on fire. He was thrown off the train, his equipment smashed, his pride in pieces. It was a lesson in consequences and in how quickly the world could take away what little you had. He tried to find other work. He became a telegraph operator, learning the code by ear, his half-deafness forcing him to concentrate harder than anyone else. The job was lonely, the hours long, the mistakes costly. He was fired more than once for inattention, for tinkering with the equipment, for asking too many questions. Failure followed him everywhere. He moved from town to town, always searching for a place to belong, always running from the shame of being difficult, slow, trouble. He slept in cheap boarding houses, ate when he could, and sent what little money he had home to his mother. He watched other boys his age go to school, make friends, build lives. He wondered if he would ever have anything more than this work, hunger, and the constant ache of not being enough. The self-doubt was relentless. Every failure, every firing, every night spent alone in a strange town chipped away at his confidence. He began to wonder if the teacher had been right, if he really was addled, if he really was destined to be nothing. But he kept going. He kept experimenting, kept learning, kept asking questions. He built small inventions, an improved telegraph, a vote recorder, a stock ticker, most of them failures, all of them lessons. He learned that the world would not wait for him to catch up. He learned that survival meant moving forward, even when you had nothing left. This was not the story of a genius in the making. It was the story of a boy who worked because he had to, who failed because he tried, who survived because he refused to stop. Edison's early years were not a prelude to greatness. They were a test of endurance, and the test never really ended. There's a certain kind of loneliness that comes from living in the margins, from being the one who never quite fits. For Thomas Edison, the telegraph was both a lifeline and a prison. It was a job that paid barely, and a world that demanded precision from a mind that was always wandering. He became a telegraph operator out of necessity, not passion. The work was relentless, long hours, night shifts, the constant clatter of code in his ears. He moved from city to city, never staying long, always looking for a place that would tolerate his quirks. He was half-deaf, which made the job harder, but he compensated by feeling the vibrations of the machine, by watching the patterns, by inventing new ways to keep up. But he was never fast enough, never focused enough. He was fired again and again, sometimes for falling asleep at the key, sometimes for tinkering with the equipment, sometimes for asking too many questions. He was the operator who couldn't just do the job, He had to take it apart, see how it worked, try to make it better. Most bosses had no patience for that. They wanted reliability, not invention. He lived in boarding houses, slept in his clothes, ate when he could. He sent what little money he made home to his mother, always feeling like it wasn't enough. The other operators laughed at him, called him the professor, mocked his endless experiments and his strange, distracted ways. He was alone in a room full of people, the outsider who never quite belonged. Failure was constant. He tried to build a telegraph that could send multiple messages at once. It didn't work. He tried to invent a machine that would automatically record votes in Congress. No one wanted it. He tried to improve the stock ticker, but the first version broke down in front of investors. Every idea seemed to end in disappointment. Every risk in another lesson about how little the world cared for dreamers. But he couldn't stop. The failures stung, but they also fueled him. He learned from every mistake, every broken machine, every lost job. He became obsessed with the idea that if he just tried one more time, if he just worked a little harder, he could make something that mattered. The pressure was relentless. The money was never enough. The loneliness was crushing. But Edison kept going, kept failing, kept learning. He was not a genius. He was a survivor. And survival meant never giving up, no matter how many times the world told him to stop. This was not the story of a man destined for greatness. It was the story of a man who failed, and failed, and failed again, because failure was the only way forward. There's a myth that invention is a spark, a single moment of brilliance. For Thomas Edison, it was a grind. It was hunger, debt, and the constant threat of collapse. By his early 20s, Edison was living in rented rooms, scraping by on odd jobs, and the hope that one of his ideas would finally pay off. He was always tinkering, always building, always chasing the next breakthrough. He invented a vote recorder for Congress. No one wanted it. He built a stock ticker, his first real success. But the money vanished almost as quickly as it came. He was paid a lump sum, and for a moment, he thought he was safe. But the cost of living, the cost of materials, the cost of failure ate through his savings. He was back to borrowing, back to hustling, back to wondering if he'd ever be more than a curiosity. He rented a small workshop in Newark, New Jersey, and filled it with wires, batteries, and the smell of burning insulation. He hired a handful of assistants, men as desperate as he was, and paid them when he could. They worked long hours, slept on benches, and ate whatever they could afford. The workshop was a place of hope and exhaustion, of wild ideas and constant disappointment. Edison's inventions were often ahead of their time, or just out of reach. He tried to build a machine that would send multiple telegraph messages at once. It worked sometimes. Investors were interested, But the technology was unreliable. He tried to improve the printing telegraph, but the patents were a legal minefield. He was sued, threatened, and nearly ruined more than once. The pressure was relentless. Every failure meant more debt, more hunger, more doubt. He pawned his tools, borrowed from friends, and wrote desperate letters to his family. He watched other inventors succeed, watched their names in the papers, watched their fortunes rise. He wondered if he would ever escape the grind, if he would ever be more than a man chasing ghosts. But he couldn't stop. The work was an obsession, a compulsion, a way to keep the darkness at bay. He slept in his workshop, ate when he remembered, and drove himself and his assistants to the edge of collapse. He was not a genius. He was a man on the brink, surviving one experiment at a time. This was not the story of a man destined for greatness. It was the story of a man who risked everything, lost almost as much, and kept going because stopping meant disappearing. Edison's first inventions didn't make him rich. They made him relentless, and the cost was only beginning. Menlo Park was supposed to be a sanctuary. For Thomas Edison, it became a crucible. He was in his late 20s when he convinced investors to back his dream. A real laboratory, a place where invention could be industrialized, where failure could be turned into progress. The money was just enough to buy a patch of land in rural New Jersey and build a cluster of wooden buildings, workshops, storerooms, a boarding house for his assistants. He called it the Invention Factory. The press called it Edison's Folly. The pressure was immediate and suffocating. Investors wanted results. The public wanted miracles. Edison wanted everything. He hired a team of young men, brilliant, hungry, and just as desperate as he was. They worked around the clock, sleeping on cots in the lab, eating cold meals at their benches, living in a fog of chemicals and exhaustion. Edison was always there, prowling the halls at night, pushing, demanding, refusing to let anyone rest. Sleep became optional. Meals were forgotten. The line between day and night blurred. The only thing that mattered was the next experiment, the next breakthrough, the next chance to prove that Menlo Park was not a mistake. Edison's obsession infected everyone. He kept notebooks filled with wild ideas, some brilliant, some impossible, all urgent. He drove his team to the edge, then over it. He berated them for mistakes, praised them for endurance, and reminded them constantly that failure was not an option. But failure was everywhere. Machines broke. Chemicals exploded. Promising ideas fizzled out in the cold light of morning. The pressure never stopped. Investors visited often, demanding updates, demanding results, demanding to know when the next invention would pay off. Edison smiled for the newspapers, posed for photographs, and hid the panic that gnawed at him every night. The money was always running out. The debts were always growing. The world was watching. waiting for him to fall. He became a stranger to his own family. He missed meals, missed birthdays, missed the slow collapse of his first marriage. The lab was his home, his refuge, his prison. He was surrounded by people, but more alone than ever. Menlo Park was not a place of genius. It was a place of survival. Every day was a test. Every night was a battle against exhaustion, against doubt, against the fear that it would all come crashing down. This was not the story of a man in control. It was the story of a man driven to the edge by the need to prove himself, to justify the faith of others, to silence the voice that said he was still just a sickly, addled child. Menlo Park was not a sanctuary. It was a furnace, and Edison was burning himself to keep the lights on. Failure wasn't a chapter in Edison's story. It was the story. Menlo Park became a graveyard of broken ideas. The walls were lined with shelves of failed prototypes, glass tubes that shattered, filaments that burned out, batteries that leaked acid onto the floor. The air was thick with the smell of scorched metal and disappointment. Every day, Edison and his team tried something new. Every night, they swept up the wreckage and started again. He was obsessed with the process. He kept meticulous notebooks, recording every attempt, every variable, every tiny change. He believed that if he just tried enough times, if he just failed in enough ways, he would eventually find the answer. "I have not failed," he told a reporter. "I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." But the joke was thin. The truth was exhaustion. The pressure was relentless. Investors grew impatient. The newspapers, once dazzled by Edison's promises, began to mock him. Wizard or fraud, the headlines asked. The world wanted results. Edison gave them failure. He barely slept. He prowled the lab at all hours, waking his assistants to try new ideas, to fix what had broken, to start over from scratch. He snapped at mistakes, demanded more, pushed everyone, including himself, past the point of reason. Meals were skipped, tempers flared. Men quit, unable to take the grind, the endless cycle of hope and disappointment. Edison's health began to crack. He lost weight. His hands shook. His hearing grew worse. He was haunted by the fear that he was wasting his life, that he was chasing ghosts, that the world would remember him as a fool. But he couldn't stop. The work was everything. The work was the only thing. He sacrificed everything for the next experiment. He missed the birth of his children, the death of his mother, the slow collapse of his marriage. He was a stranger in his own home, a ghost in his own life. The lab was his world, and failure was his only companion. The team at Menlo Park learned to endure. They learned to expect disappointment, to find meaning in the process, to keep going when every instinct said to quit. They watched Edison push himself to the edge, watched him risk everything for a chance at something new. They admired him. They feared him. They pitied him. This was not the story of a genius at work. It was the story of a man consumed by obsession. A man who measured his life in failures. A man who believed that the only way out of the dark was to keep burning himself down to the wick. Thousands of failed experiments. Thousands of reasons to quit. But Edison refused. He endured. And the cost was written in every scar, every sleepless night, every empty chair at his family table. This was the moment where obsession nearly replaced humanity. And the world kept watching, waiting to see if he would finally break. The world loves a genius until he starts to look like a fool. By the late 1870s, Thomas Edison was no longer just a curiosity. He was a target. The newspapers that once called him a wizard now called him a fraud. The public, hungry for miracles, grew impatient with promises and tired of waiting for results. Investors whispered about pulling out. Rivals mocked him in print. Edison's folly they called Menlo Park, the wizard of flops. He tried to ignore it. He told himself it didn't matter. But the headlines stung. The laughter echoed in the empty halls of his lab. He felt the pressure in every question, every visit from a skeptical backer, every letter from a creditor demanding payment. The world was watching, waiting for him to fail. In public, Edison smiled for the cameras, posed for portraits, and made bold predictions. In private, he was unraveling. He stopped going home. He stopped sleeping. He prowled the lab at all hours, muttering to himself, scribbling notes, chasing ideas that grew more desperate with every failure. He berated his assistants, demanded more, pushed them to exhaustion. Some quit, some stayed, drawn by his obsession, afraid of his temper. He became a stranger to his own family. His wife, Mary, saw him less and less. His children learned to tiptoe around him, to avoid the lab, to accept that their father belonged to his work, not to them. The house was filled with silence and the smell of chemicals. The man who had once been a curious boy was now a ghost in his own home. The ridicule grew louder. Cartoons in the papers showed Edison as a madman, surrounded by broken machines and empty promises. Rivals like Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse took shots at him, calling him a showman, a thief, a man who took credit for the work of others. Edison fought back, but the battles left him more isolated, more obsessed, more determined to prove the world wrong. He poured himself into the work. He kept failing. He kept going. The line between progress and self-destruction blurred. He told himself that if he just worked harder, if he just tried one more time, he could silence the laughter, erase the doubt, make the world believe again. But the cost was mounting. His health suffered. His marriage suffered. His mind grew darker, more frantic, more consumed by the need to win. The world saw a genius on the brink. Edison saw only the next experiment, the next chance, the the next long night in the lab. This was not the story of a man in control. It was the story of a man driven to the edge by public ridicule and private obsession. A man who could not stop, even as the world waited for him to fall. The world remembers the light. It forgets the darkness that came before. By the time Edison's team at Menlo Park finally made a carbon filament glow, the lab was a graveyard of failed ideas and broken men. The pressure was suffocating. Investors were threatening to pull out. The newspapers had already written his obituary. His marriage was a memory, his children strangers, his health a casualty of endless nights and bottomless coffee. The experiments had become a ritual of desperation. Filament after filament, bamboo, cotton, platinum, cardboard, even beard hair, each one burning out, shattering, or simply refusing to shine. The team worked in shifts, sleeping on benches, eating when they remembered, their hands stained with chemicals, and their eyes red from exhaustion. Edison prowled the lab, refusing to rest, refusing to let anyone else rest. He was gaunt, hollow-eyed, and driven by a need that bordered on madness. He kept meticulous notes, recording every failure, every tiny change. He believed that the answer was out there, if only he could endure long enough to find it. Sleep became optional, he joked to a reporter, but the joke was thin. The truth was that he was burning himself down to the wick. The breakthrough, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. A carbonized cotton thread, sealed in a vacuum, glowed for hours. The team watched in silence, too tired to celebrate, too afraid to believe it would last. Edison stared at the bulb, his hands shaking, his mind racing with the possibilities. And the debts, the lawsuits, the next round of experiments that would be needed to make it real. The world called it a miracle. The newspapers hailed him as a genius again. Investors returned. The ridicule faded, replaced by applause. But the cost was written in every line on Edison's face, every scar on his hands, every empty chair at his family table. He had done it. He had brought light to the darkness, but the darkness inside him remained. The exhaustion was total. The victory was hollow. The work was not finished. There were still problems to solve: distribution, manufacturing, patents, rivals waiting to tear him down. The pressure never stopped. The obsession never faded. The world saw the light. Edison saw only the next battle. This was not the story of a triumphant genius. It was the story of a man who survived by refusing to quit, who found success only after sacrificing everything else. The light bulb was not the end. It was just another night in a life defined by exhaustion, obsession, and the relentless need to keep going. Success didn't bring peace. It brought a new kind of war. The light bulb was only the beginning. To make it matter, Edison needed to power the world. He bet everything on direct current, DC, his system, his patents, his legacy. But a new rival, George Westinghouse, backed by Nikola Tesla, was pushing alternating current AC. It was cheaper, more efficient, and threatened to make Edison obsolete. The fight was brutal. Edison launched a public campaign to discredit AC, warning of its dangers, staging gruesome demonstrations where animals were electrocuted to prove his point. He lobbied politicians, manipulated the press, and used every tool at his disposal to protect his invention. The newspapers called it the War of Currents. The public called it a circus. The pressure was relentless. Edison's obsession with winning blurred the line between competition and cruelty. He authorized the use of AC in the first electric chair, hoping to brand it as deadly in the public mind. He watched as the execution went horribly wrong, the condemned man suffering in front of a horrified crowd. The backlash was immediate. Some called Edison a monster. Others called him desperate. He told himself it was necessary, that the ends justified the means. But the guilt lingered. The war consumed him. He neglected his other projects, alienated his team, and grew more isolated. He was haunted by the fear that he would lose everything he had built, that the world would move on without him. He worked longer hours, slept even less, and pushed everyone around him to the breaking point. The moral cost was real. Edison had always believed in progress, in the power of invention to make the world better. Now he was fighting dirty, sacrificing his principles for the sake of survival. He saw himself becoming the villain in his own story, but he couldn't stop. The pressure never let up. The obsession never faded. In the end, AC won. Westinghouse and Tesla powered the Chicago World's Fair, lighting up the night and proving that Edison's system was obsolete. The world moved on. Edison was left with his patents, his pride, and the knowledge that he had crossed lines he could never uncross. This was not the story of a hero. It was the story of a man at war with the world and with himself. The War of Currents was a battle for the future, but it was also a battle for Edison's soul, and the scars would never fully heal. The world saw Edison as a titan, an inventor, a businessman, a man who had bent the future to his will. But inside the walls of his empire, the cost of that power was everywhere. He had built a company, then an industry, then a legend. But the bigger it got, the more he needed to control. He micromanaged every project, every patent, every assistant. He demanded loyalty, demanded secrecy, demanded that his name be on every invention, even those he barely touched. The men who worked for him, brilliant minds in their own right, became shadows. Their ideas, swallowed by Edison's, need to be the face of progress. The lawsuits multiplied. Rivals accused him of theft, of bullying, of using the courts to crush competition. Former allies turned against him, claiming he had stolen their work, their credit, their futures. The press, once his ally, began to question the myth. Was Edison a genius, or just a master of taking what others had built? He fought back, always. He hired lawyers, bought silence, spun stories for the newspapers. He told himself it was necessary, that the world was ruthless, that only the strong survived. But the pressure was relentless. Every new invention brought new enemies, new betrayals, new doubts. The ethical lines blurred. He cut corners, rushed products to market, ignored safety warnings. He pushed his team to exhaustion, then blamed them when things went wrong. He was obsessed with being first, with being best, with being remembered. The work was never enough. The recognition was never enough. The power was never enough. His family saw less and less of him. His health declined. He became more irritable, more suspicious, more alone. The empire he had built was a fortress, but it was also a prison. He trusted almost no one. He confided in even fewer. The world outside kept changing. New inventors, new technologies, new threats. Edison fought to keep up, to stay relevant, to hold on to the power he had sacrificed so much to gain. But the cost was mounting. The lawsuits, the scandals, the betrayals, they were all signs that the world was moving on, with or without him. This was not the story of a benevolent genius. It was the story of a man who had become trapped by his own legend, who had sacrificed ethics for control, who had built a legacy on the backs of others, and could not let go. The pressure never stopped. The obsession never faded. And the cost was written in every broken partnership, every lost friend, every night spent alone in the dark. The body always keeps score. For Thomas Edison, the years of sleepless nights, chemical fumes, and relentless pressure finally caught up with him. By his late 50s, the man who had once prowled his labs for days without rest was running on fumes. His hearing, never strong, faded further. He missed conversations, misheard questions, and sometimes retreated into silence, rather than admit he couldn't follow. His hands, once steady, began to tremble. He suffered from chronic pain, headaches, stomach problems, a constant ache in his joints. The doctors told him to slow down, to rest, to let others take over. He ignored them. He pushed harder. He worked longer hours, demanded more from his team, and refused to acknowledge his own limits. He was haunted by the fear that if he stopped, even for a moment, the world would pass him by. He was still obsessed with the next invention, the next breakthrough, the next chance to prove he was not finished. But the strain was visible. He snapped at his assistants, berated his family, and grew more isolated. The lab, once a place of camaraderie and hope, became a place of tension and exhaustion. Men came and went, unable to keep up with the pace, unwilling to sacrifice as much as Edison demanded. He began to forget things, appointments, names, even the details of his own inventions. He wrote notes to himself, filled notebooks with reminders, tried to keep track of a mind that was slipping. The pressure never let up. The world still expected miracles. Investors still wanted results. Rivals still circled, waiting for him to falter. His family watched with growing concern. His children saw less and less of him. His wife worried about his health, about the toll the work was taking, about the man she barely recognized anymore. Edison brushed off their concerns, insisting that he was fine, that he just needed more time, more work, more results. But the truth was inescapable. The years of obsession had left him physically and mentally exhausted. The man who had once seemed unstoppable was now fighting a battle he could not win, not against the world, but against his own body, his own mind, his own relentless need to keep going. This was not the story of a triumphant old age. It was the story of a man worn down by his own ambition, a man who had sacrificed everything for progress and was now paying the price. The pressure never stopped. The obsession never faded. And the cost was written in every line on his face, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt and pain. Obsession is a lonely companion. As Edison aged, the world he'd built grew quieter, emptier, more distant. The price of never stopping was paid in the currency of human connection. His first marriage had collapsed under the weight of neglect and exhaustion. Mary, his wife, had died young, her health worn down by years of absence, by the constant smell of chemicals, by a husband who was always at the lab, never at home. Edison remarried, but the pattern repeated. Mina, his second wife, tried to bring warmth and order to his life, but she was often left alone in the big house, raising their children, while Edison haunted his laboratories. His children grew up in the shadow of his legend. Some tried to follow in his footsteps, working in his companies, seeking his approval. Others rebelled, resenting the father who was never there, who measured love in patents and progress. Family dinners were rare. Conversations were brief, distracted, always interrupted by the next idea, the next experiment, the next crisis. Friends drifted away. Old colleagues, once inspired by his vision, left after years of exhaustion and credit denied. New assistants came and went, unable to keep up with the pace, unwilling to sacrifice as much as Edison demanded. The lab, once a place of camaraderie, became a place of tension and silence. Edison's isolation was self-imposed, but it was also a consequence of his obsession. He trusted few, confided in fewer. He became suspicious, even paranoid, convinced that rivals were stealing his ideas, that former allies were plotting against him. He kept secrets, locked away notebooks, and built walls, literal and figurative, between himself and the world. The loneliness was palpable. He spent long nights alone in the lab, surrounded by the ghosts of failed experiments and the echo of his own footsteps. He wrote letters to old friends and rarely sent them. He read the newspapers, searching for his name, desperate for proof that he still mattered. The world outside moved on. New inventors, new technologies, new headlines. Edison watched as his influence faded, as the world he had shaped began to forget him. He felt the sting of irrelevance, the ache of being left behind. This was not the story of a man at peace. It was the story of a man who had sacrificed everything for his work and was now left with the silence that follows obsession. The pressure never stopped. The loneliness never faded, and the cost was written in every empty chair, every unanswered letter, every night spent alone in the dark. The world doesn't wait for legends. As the 20th century raced forward, Thomas Edison found himself chasing shadows, his own, and those of the men who had once been his rivals, now the new faces of progress. He kept inventing, kept filing patents, kept pushing for the next big thing. But the world was changing faster than he could adapt. His storage battery project, once hailed as the future, drained his fortune and delivered little. His attempt to mine iron ore in New Jersey was a disaster, millions lost. Years wasted, the land scarred and abandoned. He tried to improve cement, to build better phonographs, to find new uses for old ideas. Most of it failed. The press, once eager for his every word, now covered his setbacks with a hint of pity, sometimes with open mockery. He watched as younger inventors, men like Henry Ford, whom Edison had once mentored, surpassed him. The headlines belonged to others. The world's attention shifted to airplanes, radio, and new wonders that Edison could not claim. He was still respected, still a name, but no longer the center of the storm. The failures stung. They were public, expensive, and impossible to hide. Investors grew wary. His companies struggled. He was forced to sell assets, to lay off workers, to admit defeat in projects he had once believed would change everything. The pressure was still there, but now it was tinged with desperation. He worked longer hours, slept even less, convinced that one more breakthrough would restore his place in the world. But the world had moved on. The crowds that once gathered outside his lab were gone. The reporters who once hung on his every word now sought out new voices, new stories. Edison felt the sting of irrelevance, the ache of being left behind by the very future he had helped create. His health declined further. The long nights, the chemical fumes, the years of neglect took their toll. He was often ill, often exhausted, often alone. The lab, once alive with energy, was now a quieter place, filled with memories and regrets. He tried to find comfort in his legacy, in the inventions that had changed the world. But the failures haunted him. The world saw a legend. Edison saw the cost, the projects that never worked, the fortunes lost, the relationships broken, the years spent chasing a light that always seemed just out of reach. This was not the story of a triumphant old age. It was the story of a man who could not stop, even as the world stopped caring. The pressure never left. The failures never faded. And the cost was written in every empty room, every abandoned project, every headline that no longer bore his name. History remembers the light. It forgets the darkness that made it. In the final years of his life, Thomas Edison was a man surrounded by the evidence of his own endurance, patents on the wall, inventions in museums, his name etched into the story of the modern world. But the cost of that legacy was everywhere too. It was in the empty chairs at his family table, in the strained faces of his children, in the silence that filled his home when the lab doors finally closed. He was celebrated, yes. He was honored, yes. But he was also alone. The world called him a genius, but he knew what it had taken to earn that word. He knew the price of never stopping. The friendships lost, the marriages broken, the children who grew up in the shadow of a man who was always working, always chasing, always just out of reach. He looked back and saw the failures as clearly as the triumphs. The inventions that never worked, the fortunes lost, the years spent in darkness and doubt. He saw the faces of the men and women who had worked beside him, many of whom had been forgotten, their names erased by his need to be the one remembered. He saw the lines he had crossed, the corners he had cut, the moments when obsession had replaced humanity. He wondered if it had been worth it, if the world was truly better for all the light he had brought, or if something essential had been lost along the way. He wondered if anyone would remember the man, or only the myth. In the end, Edison's legacy was not just invention. It was the lesson that progress demands sacrifice. That obsession can build the future, but destroy the present. That the cost of never stopping is paid in loneliness, in exhaustion, in the quiet moments when the world is no longer watching. He died in 1931, the world dimming its lights in tribute. But the darkness he had fought so hard to control was never really gone. It lived on in the stories of those who survived him, in the empty spaces he left behind, in the knowledge that every act of creation comes with a price. This was not the story of a flawless genius. It was the story of a man who endured the cost of never stopping, a man who built the future and paid for it with his own life.